Good afternoon, Rabbi Michael Balinsky.
Hi.
Would you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Rabbi Michael Balinsky. I'm currently the Executive Vice President of the Chicago Board of Rabbis.
Great, thank you. Would you define interfaith dialogue? What does interfaith dialogue mean to you?
Well, that's going to vary among the people with whom one is having interfaith dialogue and what the intent is. I think for some, it's an attempt for people who share a deep religious commitment to get to know each other, to speak out of the strength, out of their commitment and the strength to their own particular religious tradition, but at the same time understand that while there may be significant doctrinal differences, and I don't want to collapse those, significant differences of belief and practice, and I don't want to collapse any distinctions there either. At the same time, there is something about the religious spiritual impulse which I think is important and has a certain almost attraction for people to get to know. Now, that may be at one level. I think at a more, I don't want to necessarily say basic level, but also at an extremely important level. It's seeking to work with other religious communities for the betterment of the greater society. That we all have concerns for the greater society, and working together to improve those is certainly something positive. But I think that genuine interfaith dialogue can go beyond that, and not to belittle the importance of it, but I think it can go beyond that to allow people to really discuss their faith, their beliefs, their practices, so that others will gain a sense of knowledge and hopefully deep friendship, which I think is critical. I think part of interfaith dialogue is working with the other to know, so that the other will know what gives me joy, and the other will know what pains me. And I think the final aspect also is those of us involved in religious life, and those of us who have spent our lives, or a good portion of our lives, committed to the study of our particular religious tradition, and are committed deeply to its practice, need, I think, at times the opportunity to meet other people. And so that it makes another religious practice, another religion with its own set of doctrines, practices, and the like, but concrete into a real person. Issues become people. And I think that element is really critical and important because ultimately we're part of this diverse world, and we have to live together in this diverse world. And I'm a deep believer in maintaining religious integrity, religious distinctiveness. I'm not that interested in spending time looking at commonalities to say, oh, we're really alike, although there may very well be many of those. But it's still, with all of that, it's important that we really get to know each other, and each other as the distinct, creative, hopefully wonderful people that each of us is.
Great, thank you for a very comprehensive definition. What do you think the target audience for interfaith dialogue?
Yeah, that's a tough question, who the target audience is. I always, quite frankly, have a certain hesitancy to participate in interfaith dialogue from the Jewish side, if I can call it the side, with Jews who maybe, deeply have a sense of commitment as Jews, love being Jews, but are not necessarily knowledgeable about their tradition, and aren't necessarily fluent with the text, the practices and understandings of the tradition. I am hesitant sometimes when those folks are involved in interfaith dialogue, when they start talking about their faith, and they are not necessarily operating from the most sophisticated sense or knowledgeable sense. Deep commitment sense for sure. But I think religious traditions, certainly I'll just speak from Judaism's perspective, this is a tradition that one spends one's life studying. This is a tradition that is rich in a textual tradition, the necessity of knowing Hebrew, Aramaic, studying text in the original language, and you have to have a good solid background. So I hesitate sometimes when dealing with interfaith discussion, which discusses the faith. Mm-hmm. I'm not talking about common social concerns, but when discusses the faith, that the participants be people who are knowledgeable in their faith and tradition, and can speak with a certain, I'll say authority with a small a, but an authority based on a certain amount of knowledge. That to me is critical for good interfaith dialogue. At the same time, that doesn't exclude people from different religious communities working on important issues together. So just take one contemporary issue. The Catholics, certainly in Chicago, the Catholics have been leaders in, although other communities deeply involved in many, many ways, but they've taken at times a certain leadership role in issues of immigration and immigration reform and all the complexities that are going on now in America. To be involved in the immigration issue, there's something I think Jewish tradition says about immigration and immigrants and what that means, and other religious traditions as well. But the work that's being done on it is more of a social civil type work. So in that case, I think people representing, just again from a Jewish point of view, the Jewish community, I'm not worried how deeply knowledgeable they are with every text of Judaism. But if it's their sense of Jewishness and Judaism that commits them to working on behalf of the stranger, on behalf of those who are disenfranchised, then that is to me wonderfully positive. But I wouldn't necessarily I wouldn't make that a deep theological discussion. I think that's religion in practice and an important practice. So I think it just depends on the setting and the topic and really one wants to achieve with interfaith dialogue.
Great. What do you think the challenges of interfaith dialogue in North America?
Well, there is a lot of it. I think there's almost an ethos of people wanting to do interfaith dialogue in North America, which I think is positive, very positive. I think there's a couple of dangers. One is that we try to find the most common denominator, the lowest common denominator between us, and then we ignore critical differences. There's an element of religious tradition that if you're a deep believer in one's religious tradition, there's a certain point in which I'm right and you may be wrong. Now, by wrong, I don't mean immoral. By wrong, I don't mean you're not a significant religious personality. But there's some fundamental disagreements there. Now, that doesn't bother me. I think as long as people are upfront about it. I think the danger of interfaith dialogue and where I would tend to shy away from it, and it's a certain tension that takes place in interfaith dialogue, some of which I think is positive. I'm sorry.
No problem.
Myra, can you take this, please? My cell phone's up, not the house phone. I think one of the dangers or one of the challenges of interfaith dialogue is when I'm sitting in interfaith dialogue, if the people with whom I'm sitting, if their goal is to convert me, to spread their faith when we're sitting in dialogue, then, I think I want to get up and go home.
Of course,
now,
that
doesn't mean that I don't want them to be witnessing to the truth of their commitments. When we participate in interfaith dialogue, I'm witnessing to my understanding of the truth of Judaism. When I'm sitting with Christians, I hope they're witnessing through what they are saying to their deep held beliefs of Christianity. And though in Muslims, whether with Sikhs or Zoroastrians, whoever. I want them to be able to witness, but I'm not interested in being proselytized.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of the proselytizing element of interfaith dialogue, a lot of that has passed in the States. So I still think there's some of it there, but I think a lot of it has passed. It doesn't mean there's nothing wrong with wanting to impress upon the people with whom I'm engaging in interfaith dialogue that I come from a tradition of wisdom and insight that hopefully others can learn from. And I can learn from other religious traditions about wisdom and insight. Mm-hmm. But I'm not interested in, when I sit down to interfaith dialogue, my goal is not that, I really wish if I speak really properly and lovingly and I'll convince you'll come over and become a Jew. That's not the purpose of interfaith dialogue. Mm-hmm. And I think it would be dishonest. At the same time, certainly when I'm sitting with certain numbers of Christians, I know that ultimately they want me to become a Christian. Mm-hmm. And that they would feel, to put it another way, that without my belief in Jesus, that I'm lacking something, that they would be happy if I were to adopt that. But they're not sitting there trying to convince me, look, I'll prove it to you, or anything like that. No, we are sitting there engaged, talking about our religious traditions. So I think that's an important distinction between witnessing to who we are, but not trying to proselytize and convince, but the goal rather is to understand and share.
I see, great. Do you think it is a necessity to have interfaith dialogue in today's world?
Yeah, now more than ever. I think communities, I'll tell you a story that I heard from a Catholic scholar. One of the changes that took place in the context of the Catholic Church was Vatican II.
1965,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and a certain change that took place in a variety of things, including, in particular, a certain attitude towards Jews and Judaism. And it began a process. As my Catholic friends like to say, the Pope, the Church, may produce a document and they spend the next 50 to 100 years trying to figure out what it means, understanding it and engaging with it. But one of the reasons, the fact that it passed during the Second Vatican Council, numbers of scholars have suggested it passed through the influence of the American bishops. Now, why were the American bishops important? Because they knew Jews. In other words, they had personal encounters. In fact, one professor I heard describe it as follows. He said if you were to ask his mother 50, 60 years ago, growing up, are the Jews going to be damned or go to hell or not be saved if they don't accept Jesus? Her mother would have answered, yes, they need to accept Jesus, otherwise they will not be saved, ultimately get to heaven or whatever. But then he would say, well, what about your neighbor, Mrs. Schwartz, the Jewish neighbor? And she would say, oh, no, that doesn't apply to Mrs. Schwartz. Now, what does that mean? It's not that. It's that, yeah, you have doctrines out there, but once people know each other and are engaged with each other, then things begin to change. And then religious understandings can sometimes become transformed over time, almost perhaps at times unconsciously, because there's another person beside you who is also created in the image of God. Mm-hmm. And then doctrines and ideas ultimately have to be able to be spoken in front of the other person. And so that's, I think, one of the critical values of interfaith dialogue. Number two, certainly today with everything going on there's always been everything going on in our world, but whatever we face today, when there are issues between communities, it's good to know people. You can pick up the phone and say, explain this to me. I mean, sometimes our reaction is, oh, that's terrible what they did, and you issue a statement. Sometimes it's best to pick up the phone and say, what happened here? And to be able to get that information and to understand. So people getting to know each other is absolutely critical. And then, of course, finally, I think there's an imperative that we work together for the betterment of society. So that people from different religious traditions can work together on certain issues for the betterment of everybody is, I think, a super valuable and important contribution then of each religious tradition. I want to work together on something with you as a Christian, with you as a Muslim, with you as a Sikh, and with me as a Jew, not blurring the differences, but precisely emerging out of our own particularities that we can, with that, work together on certain things.
Great, thank you. Should we avoid having dialogue with some groups, like so-called radical groups or real radical groups?
Well, I think that has to be done very, very carefully. That has to be done carefully. I think that if that is going to happen, it has to happen. It'll probably be much better happening quietly by select individuals, because super radical groups and can be, quite frankly, dangerous. And I think that some of it is done. I know some of it goes on, but sometimes it happens quietly with certain individuals, and sometimes then certain breakthroughs are made. But that, I think there has to be a certain assumption going in that I'm sitting across people, who don't want to kill me, don't want to destroy my faith, don't want to destroy my community. So I think we have to be very careful, but in certain situations, I would certainly not exclude the possibility of that.
Okay. Should we have any concern about preserving our own cultural or religious identity of our young generation when we are having dialogue with other groups?
I think those are questions. I think that's a legitimate question. I think that's how the dialogue is done. That's why I think, particularly on I think dealing with a certain adolescent age. I mean, little kids wouldn't really bother. There's certain things you can do together and get exposed to each other. Of course, I wouldn't necessarily call that deep religious interfaith dialogue. I don't think they're intellectually mature enough to do that, but it doesn't mean they can't be exposed to each other and work on certain projects together. And there's some wonderful groups that do that and allow people to get to know each other. I think it becomes more complex when you get to high school and college age. I think then there is certainly a tremendous room for it, with an understanding that particularly during those age periods, people are evolving, developing more mature understandings of their own religious tradition. But I think it has to be, again, done not looking for the lowest common denominator, but recognizing the importance of the particularity and the strength of each tradition and what each tradition has to offer. And that, to me, I think can certainly be done.
Thank you. What about being judgmental to others' beliefs and practices in their religion? As you know, we can consider some of the beliefs of others kind of absurd. So how should we behave to others' practices? Should we be respectful, or should we discuss about their religions, practices, etc.?
Yeah, look, good religious interfaith dialogue is not going to be successful if I'm sitting with someone and says, "See, that's a stupid practice."
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that I can't enter into some critical questions about tell me about that practice. And when I see you doing that or hear you describing that, what are the assumptions behind that you are making that practice reveals?
But just for the purpose of learning, right?
Well,
Not,
for the purpose of learning,
not
yeah, for the purpose of
criticizing.
learning, but there may very well be, I mean, everyone's afraid of being judgmental. I wish people would get past that already. We always are judgmental. We make decisions every day about things. We have to make judgmental decisions about what we do. Everyone's suddenly afraid of being judgmental. But it depends how it comes across. But I think what people have to do interreligious dialogue and interfaith dialogue is something that may seem, gee, that sounds like a stupid practice. The question is not, gee, that's a stupid practice. The question is, tell me, I'm having problems understanding that. At first, when I see it, it doesn't seem to make much sense to me, or this is what I see as problematic. What are your assumptions about that practice, and how do you understand it? Now, I may still say I disagree with it in the end, and I think it's wrong or absurd. I don't have a problem with that. But at least I need to understand what are the assumptions of the practitioner of those practices, what do they think they are doing when they are doing it? And at least I have to have that knowledge. And then I can begin to enter into whatever some more, I don't want to say judgmental, but some more, critical understanding of it. And it may work for me, it may not work for me. I may say, no, I still disagree with that, and I disagree with those assumptions. I have a very different set of assumptions. Mm-hmm. That's okay. That doesn't bother me.
What do you think? What kind of programs, events, and activities can we set together to facilitate interfaith dialogue?
Well, I think certain projects working for the betterment of others is one area. For me, I have a great desire of shared text study, of sacred text of traditions. Mm-hmm. So to me, that's something which is really vital. I think what is a real interesting area is the religious communities, in one form or another, all have social service agencies. There's some general community ones, but also our particular traditions have certain types of social service agencies. They may best be serving clients of our own community. Sometimes they're serving a variety of clients. But they're operating out of the sense of their tradition. So I think what's really interesting is to, explore these and say, all right, what out of Judaism, or even fill in the tradition, what generates how you run what you're doing? And I think that's a really important learning project to see that, particularly in social service areas that are helping people, that people may very well be operating out of some deep sense of religious commitments and expressions and assumptions, and what are those and how that shapes the practice of the is deeply opposed to interfaith prayer. In many, many cases, interfaith prayer means going into a church, and it's essentially Christian prayer, and you throw in a few other people. Now, again, I have nothing against churches, and I think Christians should pray in churches. I am all for that. But just speaking very personally, a church is not my sacred space. And I would say the same thing about a mosque. Mm-hmm. It's not my sacred space. And that therefore, the sense of, nor would I expect necessarily Christians to be comfortable, or Muslims or whoever, being worshiping in a synagogue. I have no issues with that. But I think and I think there is a certain fundamental sense of prayer and an intimacy of prayer that I cannot share with others. Mm-hmm. And I cannot share it in someone else's sacred space. And particularly a sacred space, which I'm saying out of them, my respect for my Christian friends is don't expect me to pray in a sacred space in which I reject the very foundation of what makes your space sacred. Out of respect for you, I'm not going to do that. Because I stand in opposition to that. And therefore, out of respect for you, I'm not going to do that. I think we can find common spaces to do certain types of services, but I don't think interfaith services, qua services, are terribly important. I think it just involves a lot of watering down of specifics, and I think it really distorts each tradition's fundamental understandings of what prayer is and what relationship with God is. That doesn't mean we can't. Now, that doesn't mean I've been involved with this, where I've convened with members of the Council of Religious Leaders, where we've done prayers for peace. We did it in an open public setting, and each tradition did something from their tradition of a prayer for peace. I think that's fine. I think it's deep. I think it's meaningful. And I am therefore offering something out of my tradition in a space that is not privileged by any other religious tradition. I don't have a problem with that. And particularly in those settings, I would want Christians or Muslims to pray as Christians or Muslims, or Sikhs to pray as Sikhs, not to water it down so everyone can feel comfortable. But at the same time, I'm not interested in prayer in other people's sacred spaces.
I see. Thank you. I'm done with my questions. If you would like to add something as an advice to our young generation who would like to make interfaith dialogue on the ground, please welcome.
Yeah, I would say as follows. Get to know each other. Have deep respect for your own religious tradition. Understand what you know about your tradition and what you do not know. And being able to share that. But I think most important is really to get to know each other and respect those boundaries and distinctions between that people have between each other. And that I think really allows you to be open to get to know each other, and then also do something about it. Either work together on a project, and also when you are with fellow co-religionists and someone says, oh, they only, you are able to say, no, I know them, I'm friends with them. Their religious practice may have different religious practices, but this is this is how they try to understand what they're doing. And I think that piece is really critical. I think people who are practicing their religious faith have something critically important to offer the world as a whole, so offer the broader community as a whole, and I think can intuit that there's something really important and sacred that they are doing. And it may be different understandings of the sacred. It may be at times contradictory or mutually exclusive understandings of the sacred. But we know there's something sacred going on. And to have that intuition of the sacred, to be able to appreciate someone else's sacred and sacred practice without compromising your own, I think can in some of it lead even to greater appreciation of your own, as long as what comes with it, with all of that, is a sense of the divine in each person, which allows and which gives expression to their sense of the sacred. And finally, the young people involved in interfaith, don't think you're going to convince anyone else of your truth. Mm-hmm. You want to explain who you are, but you're not trying to proselytize. Mm-hmm. If your goal is to make me like you, then skip interfaith dialogue. If your goal is to listen and appreciate and understand and learn and potentially work together, then go for it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for this very informative and insightful dialogue and interview. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Okay, thank you. Take care.
Bye.